This is a Gyuto and this is a chef's knife. What's the difference? Well, they're kind of the same. All right, that's it. We can end the video. No, seriously, hear me out. So today we're going to talk about the Gyuto and the chef's knife, some of the similarities and some of the differences, and hopefully help you figure out which one you want. So these are the first two kitchen knives I ever owned. This one was a gift when I told my mom I wanted to be a chef. It's a good old Henkel's 6-inch chef's knife. And this is my Moritaka Ishime 240 Gyuto. This is the first Japanese knife I ever bought, back when Kevin just had one Knifewear store in Calgary. They're both great knives. They both live in my kitchen, and I use them both. The first main difference between Western knives and Japanese knives is the steel they're made out of. German knives, or Western knives in general, tend to be made out of softer steel. It's going to be more durable and often easier for the maker to work with, but it doesn't hold an edge as long, and it can't get as sharp. A Japanese knife, by comparison, is made from much harder steel. Now that's going to allow it to take a sharper edge and hold that edge, but also stay sharp a lot longer than a softer Western knife. They're also made a lot differently. A lot of more production style knives, typically the blades stamped out, sharpened, you know, they put on a handle, all that sort of thing. But some of the fancier Japanese knives are actually made by hand. This one in particular is made by a blacksmithing family. It's been around for over 700 years, and that skill's been passed down through 31 generations. So with Japanese knives, you can often get a lot of that romance and history and really crazy, awesome craftsmanship that goes into making a handmade knife. The steel a knife's made out of not only affects the sharpness, but it also affects the way the knife is shaped. So if we look at these two next to each other, often Western knives are much thicker. The blade actually is more of a wedge, and it comes down to a nice point. It's tapered down, but it's much thicker up behind the edge, and the spine is very thick, often a few millimeters thick. Harder steel, the blacksmiths or the maker can make that blade a lot thinner. Even right behind the edge, it's very, very, very thin. And so a Japanese knife is often going to glide through food more smoothly, a little more like a soft kind of silky feel, whereas a German knife is going to wedge a little more when you're cutting harder foods. Now that doesn't mean that the Japanese knife is always better. It's a matter of using the right tool for the job. I use my Japanese knives when I'm cutting vegetables and boneless meat and that sort of thing. They're absolute lasers that just glide through stuff, and they're so much fun to use. They're just unbelievably sharp. If you've never used one before, it totally blows your mind the first time you use one. Now, just because a Japanese knife stays sharp longer and takes a sharper edge doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be better for every job in your kitchen. Sure, it's a laser when it cuts through vegetables and boneless meat, and that's what I use my Japanese knives for. But you run into a bone or something frozen, or you try to pry, and you're going to chip this knife. Not maybe, you will chip this knife doing those jobs. Even scraping across the cutting board to move food around, that can be really hard on the edge. Softer steel, by comparison, is a lot more durable, a lot more rugged. It can handle cutting through frozen stuff, often, bones. You might still roll the edge a little bit, but you're not going to get a big chip like you would with a more delicate knife. So it's a matter of using the right tool for the right job. I use the analogy a lot of a 4x4 and a Ferrari. It's ideal to have both in your garage. You could have this really rough, tough vehicle for doing off-roading, chucking firewood in the back, all sorts of jobs like that. But it's also really fun to have a super fast sports car that goes really smoothly down the highway. And that's really the comparison here. You have your rough, tough, rugged knife, and you have your laser surgical instrument. So I can tell you about knives all day long. It's actually my job, but it's a lot more fun to actually show you them in action and show some really fine differences of what makes the two knives different to hopefully help you decide which is going to be best in your kitchen. So we're going to do a little side-by-side comparison, show you differences in the edges, but also differences in the way the knife is shaped. It's called the knife geometry. That's kind of getting into knife nerd territory, but it really does make a difference how the body of the knife is shaped and not just how sharp the actual edge is. I've got a potato here, nice dense vegetable to test the thickness of the blade, but I've also got a tomato. Soft vegetables with tough skins are often the bane of dull knives. I've got a pepper here for that same reason. A lot of people tend to use serrated knives for these because they don't have a knife sharp enough to cut through the skin safely. Now I have recently sharpened both these knives, and I actually sharpened them to the exact same grit, 1000 grit. I use a professional stone that I really love. So let's get at it. Potato, Japanese knife. I like to slide my edge a little bit. Look at that. Really smooth kind of glassy finish on that potato. Do a few slices here. Say it's making some scallop potatoes. This is why I like a longer knife, because I tend to slide my blade. Knives work better by sliding than by pushing downwards. Now we're gonna do my German knife and get right in there. And it's sharp, like I just sharpened it, so it's in great shape. But as I'm cutting through, you'll see up close, the potato's kind of splitting off a little bit. I'm getting this kind of splitting motion. And when I try to cut down the middle of the potato, like a thicker piece, it can kind of break through a little more. Now both cuts are pretty smooth, but where I cut the potato in half with the German knife, it's a little coarser and rougher than the cuts made with a Japanese knife, even when I slice the whole potato in half. And that's just because the thinner knife can glide through more cleanly. That said, both knives cut great because they were both sharpened on the same stone. The big difference here is how long each one's gonna stay sharp. My German knife, if I'm using it regularly, I tend to sharpen every month or so for home use. With my Japanese knife, this particular one I'm gonna sharpen about once every 1.5 to 2 years. Let's try a tomato. Slice this guy in half. The German knife, because I did just sharpen it, cuts pretty cleanly. I can do a nice kind of pull cut like that. And I can slide like that. What you don't want to do with any kind of knife is try to push downwards. Look at that. Because it's a thicker knife, it's just kind of squishing. Even with a brand new, freshly sharpened knife, if you push into your food, it's just gonna crush it and you're gonna get a lot more of the juices coming out. You're gonna have a harder time cutting through your vegetables. Japanese blade, same kind of thing. We'll do a little pull cut back. Oh my God. Yeah, you don't even feel that. This is why we get people to test on tomatoes when they're in the store, and then sliding through really, really nice. A lot of it comes down to knife skills and technique. Even with a razor sharp Japanese knife, if you just try to push down, it's not gonna cut very well. It will cut if you push enough, but then it smacks the board and you're actually dulling your knife quicker. So regardless of what kind of knife you're using, slide the blade, you get a clean cut. As you likely saw on, especially that potato cut, the performance of a knife, a lot of it comes down to the thickness of the blade and the way it's shaped, in addition to the steel and the craftsmanship and stuff we talked about earlier. You could probably hear the difference between how a thinner knife glides through a potato, a dense vegetable, and how a thicker knife splits a little more as it's cutting. Let's look up close at the differences between these. Even just visually, you can see both start out pretty thick by the handle, but Japanese knives often have more of a taper right in as you get into the edge, and then they taper away even more towards the tip. As far as the actual thickness of the spine, kind of in the middle heel area of the blade, we've got a spine thickness of 2.6 millimeters. On the German knife, we've got a spine thickness of almost 3.7 millimeters. So this guy's quite a bit thicker. It's about 50% thicker. Even down near the edge, which is arguably the more important part of the knife to be looking at, a centimeter back from the edge, the German knife is about 1.7 millimeters. The Japanese knife isn't actually too different. It's 1.5 millimeters, but it tapers down to a really, really fine point. As we get about 0.5 centimeter from the edge, the German knife is about 1.3 millimeters or so. The Japanese knife is about 0.8 of a millimeter. And so it really tapers away to this very, very fine edge. And Japanese knives are actually meant to be maintained that way. You'll see one of the big visual differences between a Japanese knife and a German knife. These German knives kind of taper continually from the spine down to the edge, but a lot of Japanese knives are made with what we call a primary bevel, where you see this kind of band of steel where the knife has been ground down. So it's a very consistent thickness on a lot of knives from the spine down to the top of that bevel, but as soon as you get to the top of that bevel, it tapers away drastically down to the edge. Now that means that it cuts very well because the upper part of the knife isn't too thick, but it also means that when you sharpen it, you can sharpen that primary bevel and keep the knife as thin as it was when you bought it brand new. Western knives tend to not have a more established primary bevel. They just have this fine edge that you sharpen over and over. So if you're not paying attention as you sharpen these guys, they're gonna get really, really thick as the edge comes up the knife. A Japanese knife, if you sharpen it the right way, you're gonna lay it down on that bevel and you're just gonna bring that thing up the whole lifespan of the knife. So even once the knife is a tiny little toothpick, it's not gonna be too thick at the edge, and that's gonna make a big difference with performance. Lastly, one of the big differences is the actual shape of the blade. This is when we talk about a chef's knife versus a gyuto, one of the main differences that's gonna stand out to you. Look at these two blades side by side. Sure, they're both kind of long and somewhat slender, but they're actually quite different. My German knife has this real tight curve up near the tip, and a lot of folks learn to cut by leaving that tip on the board and bring the knife down like that. That, I think, is a technique that probably evolved from having knives that weren't super sharp and needed more downward force to cut. But as I showed you on that tomato, downward force doesn't equal sharpness most of the time. When you slide the knife, it's going to work more effectively. It's going to take some time to get used to that, but it's going to allow you to get far more precise, clean cuts and also be a lot safer with your knife. You're not lifting the blade all the way up where you can potentially get your fingers under it. You're just lifting it up as high as you need. Let me show you a good example of that. We've got a couple of halves of cabbage here. With a German knife, I would personally pick it up, slide it forward like that, letting my knuckle guide the blade. But if you've learned more of the paper cutter method, you're going to have to bring the knife up higher and higher as you get further down the cabbage. And when you get down here, you're lifting it up like this. Very awkward on your arm, and you're more likely to get your fingertips under the blade, and we all know that's bad. With a Japanese knife, when you're sliding the knife, you only have to bring the blade up to the very top of what you're cutting, in this case the cabbage, and you're never bringing it up further than the top of the food. You're not cranking it way up like this, which is awkward and dangerous. You're just lifting it up, sliding it down. And then your knuckle of your index finger can actually control the thickness of your cuts really nicely. So I much prefer to cut that way. And that's where the shape of a gyuto comes in. Gyutos tend to have a lot less of a curve along the edge. It's a more gradual, subtle curve than this really pronounced sweep on my German chef's knife. Now, they both have their applications, but when it comes to just basic cutting veggies, the stuff I do every single day, I prefer to use a knife with a slightly flatter edge where I'm sliding the blade. I'm letting the knife do the work for me. I'm cutting more safely and a lot more effectively. One situation where you might prefer that curvature, even if you do like to slide your knife, is with a clove of garlic. If you're using a Japanese knife to smash a clove of garlic, you can do it, and I do, but you gotta be really careful, because if you set the knife on the board the wrong way, you're gonna bend the heck out of your blade, and we actually see that a lot more than you think. A thicker knife is gonna handle more of a beating, like I said earlier, and that curvature can be really good when you're mincing garlic. Let me show you. Throw the knife over the garlic, smash. Makes it really easy to peel the garlic, so you don't actually need to fuss with it too much. Look at that. Take the root off. You can get in there and do that kind of rocking motion. I think I learned to do this from Jamie Oliver or somebody on TV when I was a kid. And this is the one cut where I do like having a little more curvature to the edge. I'll be honest, I still use Japanese knives to cut garlic, but if you like to do this really aggressive mincing, that's where a German knife is probably gonna excel a little more, especially if you're getting into something really tough, like maybe rosemary. You wanna mince up some rosemary for a stew. Some really thin knives can get a little dinged up on rosemary. You might wanna use a German knife for that. Lastly, because often German knives are thicker, there's going to be a difference in the weight and the balance. I should take the moment to say, not all Western knives are thicker. It's a general rule, it's often the case, but I got a Henkel's knife that I used to use in restaurants when I worked in restaurants, and it was a very thin, stamped out blade. The Victorinox knives we got in cooking school, those are very thin blades too, but because the blade was thinner, it could take less of a beating, and it tended to dull even faster than a regular, thicker Henkel's knife. And to me, that kind of defeated the purpose of having a Henkel's. It was really nice on tomatoes, but I had to sharpen mine at least once a week working in a restaurant, and that was a big pain. You know, my Japanese knives, I get away with sharpening a lot less often, and so having a thinner German knife kind of defeated the purpose of it. But the weight does tend to vary. If you have a thicker blade and you have this really intense riveted handle, you're gonna have a lot more weight in the blade and in the handle. Often, the Henkel salesman at the mall would say, oh, this knife's perfectly balanced. That means it's a good quality knife. Doesn't mean anything. Balance is whatever you prefer. I prefer a more forward balance. Knives with the Japanese style handle have a lot less weight in here because it's wood. There's only a little bit of steel through the handle, whereas there's a lot more of the steel in the blade, and so they're often going to balance forward. And I prefer that. The knife falls through the food a little more on its own, and I'm lazy, so I like a knife that does more of the work. This is often called a wa handle, which in Japanese just means Japanese handle, and these are often called a yo handle, which just means Western handle. That's totally personal preference. If you want a Japanese knife with a Western handle, you want a little more weight in the handle, a little bit less in the blade, that's great. They make lots of them. We have lots of them on our website. But A riveted handle is not necessary. This handle, it's another selling point that the Henkel sales guys in the mall used to use as a sign of quality. And so a lot of us came to expect this as a sign of quality. I suspect that's one of the reasons my mom bought me this as my first chef's knife when I was like 12. And don't get me wrong, it's a great knife, it's a great handle, but this is not a hammer. It doesn't need a hammer handle. This handle is plenty sturdy enough for anything that I'm ever gonna use a kitchen knife for. If I'm digging in the garden, I'm gonna use a spade. I'm not gonna use my kitchen knife. So there you have it. Those are the big differences between a Western chef's knife and a gyuto. While they essentially do the same tasks and are used to perform the same jobs, there are a lot of differences that set them apart. Which one do you need in your kitchen? I have both. I use both. I'll be honest, I use my Japanese knives way more often because I really, really love them. And I work at a knife store. But my German knife still gets plenty of action, especially if I do need to do those tougher jobs. I'm cutting through a butternut squash and I'm a little worried about my Japanese knife, or I need to just whack through a little chicken bone or something. I'm just gonna take this guy out and do the job. It's gonna do it, it's not gonna complain about it. If you just moved out on your own, or you're just starting your kitchen knife collection and you need a first knife, I would go for a gyuto. I use a 240mm gyuto, that's about 10 inches. That's what I'm comfortable with. I'm a big guy, I got big hands. For an average home cook, a little shorter, 210mm is great, but if you're gonna work in a restaurant, something a little bigger might be better. You might even wanna go a little smaller for a santoku, but a good quality Japanese knife is gonna be able to handle pretty much everything in your kitchen. Then you can add a tougher knife later on. That's gonna do the odd jobs that you do need a tough knife for, but don't do all that often. Alternatively, you can get one of these cleavers like the one on the wall behind me. They're Spanish, they do a great job. I did a video about that a little while ago. Or you could get a less hard Japanese knife, like something from Tojiro or Tamagane. It's gonna be able to take a little more of a beating. If you wanna learn more about how gyuto works, check out my buddy Mike in action. He's got a great knife skills video and he'll show you all about how to use one. This is so awkward. Sucks. I hate it. Maybe you just moved into your first apartment. I would personally get a gyuto. Gorilla tape. Tape for men. Please help. I didn't actually mean that. I promise I'm not toxically masculine. No, I can't rip it either. I'm not worthy of the Gorilla tape. You ever see Power Thirst? Power Thirst was this like old internet era energy drink, fake energy drink commercial. Power Thirst! It's the energy drink for men! Energy! End card.